You can cast spells, learn tons of skills, support allies, harm enemies, harm allies, support enemies, woo crowds, boo crowds, and most importantly, lay dragons.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be covering the Dragon Knight. I did a poll, 121 people voted. You guys voted for Dragon Knight, so I'm going to give the people what they want. Now, next up was best duo combo builds, like co-op builds. I think I'm looking forward to that build. I might make that one next, but I'll do another poll, see what you guys want. And we'll get started. So if you're new here, welcome to the channel. I've got two different types of build guides. I have beginner build guides and veteran build guides. This one is more on the veteran side of the house. It's going to be a little bit more expensive if you're a new player, but you can start with this build and go full Tindremic, be pretty good, and then get the expensive things as you develop your character. So like things like Ray's Greater Walker are really expensive, but don't be intimidated by seeing that on the screen. It's really not that hard to get this build up and running. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to talk about the build itself, how it plays, different options for when you're tweaking your character, things that you can do to, kind of min-max this character. I'm going to go through a tier list. I'm going to talk about every little detail about the character so you don't spend time building something that you're not going to enjoy playing. It should give you a general good idea of how it plays. And before I get started, I'll shout out the website. I've got mo2builds.com. I built this website. You can actually go on here and find guilds. You can click on anybody. It'll give you their information, their contact information, their Discord. Obviously, Mortal Online is much better with a guild, so I encourage you guys jump on mo2builds.com. If you want your guild listed, you can just click right here. And then also on the home page, you've got all the different build guides, you've got different tools and spreadsheets, you've got spells, you've got everything that you need as a Mortal player. So that's the shout out. Done with that. Let's get started. I'm going to kind of relax, talk about the character, talk about the build, how I play it, how I designed it, and then we'll go from there. All right, first things first, we're full Tindremic. I know it's boring, it's the white bread build, probably the most popular build in the game, full Tindremic, but it is what it is. Next up, we're age 55. We're going to hit certain breakpoints, and that's kind of the sweet spot for where we want to be. Age 55, one thing that you'll notice is the combat speed is 417. Most other footies in the game right now are running about 420 outside of the dex footies. So you're right there. I mean, 3 speed is not going to make that big of a difference. It's rarely going to be the difference between life and death. And you have a little bit less health, and you have a little bit less mana than a full dedicated mage. This is definitely a hybrid character. This character is designed to do a lot of things well, but it's not going to be the best at anything. It just has a ton of utility. It's you can play the build in a bunch of different ways. On screen here, I've got Curite head, chest, arms, and then Ranger legs with a huge Tungsteel Ironwood tower shield. It's large. It's not huge. It's not a thing, but large tower shield that will cover basically your entire body. And you can toggle that on and off. If you have the tower shield off, you at 45% mana regeneration. With it on, you're at 20% because of cleric. So I like playing this way because I like having some mana regeneration. I typically lean towards the more mage stuff, the more spell heavy stuff. So I like having the tower shield off, but if you toggle it on, you still have a little bit of mana regeneration and you turn your back to the enemy. If you're engaged in melee combat, highly suggest having that tower shield on. It's going to soak a ton of damage. And if you don't know how the damage works with tower shields right now, at least, is if somebody hits your shield, it counts as an equipment hit. And that damage is mitigated not only based on the tower shield, but also on your chest piece. So this chest piece with the Panther Scale Iron Fur has tons of blunt protection to compensate for the terrible blunt protection on a shield, so your defense is really well rounded. So if somebody's hitting your shield, it's like they're hitting your shield and your chest at the same time, so you mitigate a ton of damage. You can also play this build like this guy in the photo here and just go full steel. You can just wear full steel and go out there and be more of a tanky, like Death Knight type character. But this is the Dragon Knight. When I'm comparing the Death Knight and the Dragon Knight, the Death Knight is more focused on the foot fighter side, playing frontline with support from either walkers, Akbon, or Miasma, stuff like that. Stuff that's all listed here, which is still an option for you. But when I'm thinking Dragon Knight, I'm thinking about a little bit more towards elementalism and the different spells that you can cast here. And I'm going to talk about all of these as I get to it. But this character is a lot more mage focused, where the Death Knight would be a lot more footy focused, if that makes sense. So let's talk about the action skills here. You've got armor training, blocking, clubs, everything that you would need to be a frontline foot fighter, even defensive stances at 91. If you can find other points and shave off maybe a little bit from Necro or maybe a little bit from other things, you can get that to 100, which I think would be great. But right now the build is pretty tight. If you get one additional raw intelligence, it goes to 110. You hit that breakpoint, you get a few extra skills, and that'll allow you to maybe bump defensive stance up to 100. You really wanted to get it at that 100 with your trinkets. When you're talking about trinkets, I know I'm scatterbrained. I'm jumping all over the place. But when you're thinking about trinkets, things that you care about are raw dex, raw intelligence, strength. You have psych if you can get just basic psych. You don't need raw psych. That just gives you more mana. On your neck piece, you want defensive bonuses. Emphasis on blunt. If you can get blunt protection, that's great. Ecumenical mana reduction is really cheap, and it's a really good bonus for you. Because your ecumenical is at 100, you have earthquake, so you can knock people off of their horse with earthquake, which is really, really powerful. Since you don't really have any mounted skills, that's going to be where you get your mounted utility. So that's, in a fight, you generally want to dismount and wait for somebody to get close to you, earthquake them off their horse, and then start hitting them in the face, right? So having that ecumenical at 100, realizing earthquake is going to be really expensive and your mana is somewhat low at 147. Ecumenical mana reduction would be something that you might want to look at. Necro damage is also decent. Necro mana reduction is also decent, but try to focus on the defensive stuff because your character is not going to be the best frontline guy. So when somebody connects with you, you really need to be able to survive it and then reset the fight with spells and stuff like that. So this character, I'll talk more about playstyle when we get into the tier list, but this character is extremely fluid. You can go frontline, midline, backline, and kind of fill those roles. Not as good as the dedicated characters for those roles. You're not going to be as good as a fat mage in the backline that has like infinite mana, but you can do a lot of different things with those builds. With the necromancy, also you have Raise Greater Walker, you have Miasma, which is super popular right now. You have Ossurge, which just got nerfed, but is still pretty good. It's one of the best chasing abilities in the game right now, so you can cast while sprinting with Necro, which most people know, but people forget about. So when you're chasing somebody down, you're not super fast. So your ranged ability, the ability to Ossurge while sprinting after a target, is powerful. And now, since you have the hot swap toggle, what I would do is I would have your mace or whatever weapon type you want to use. I have hammers in here because they seem to be super, super meta right now. But let's say you have your hammer and your shield in one weapon set, and then you can swap very easily and go to your hands. So what you should be doing when you're not foot fighting is you should have your fists up, because you can sprint faster, you can move quicker, and you can cast while having your fists up. And then if somebody pushes you or you connect with a footy in some capacity, or you just need your tower shield on your back, hit E, you'll quickly swap to your weapons, and then you got your weapons back out. So if you're running somebody down and you're chasing after someone, you can Ossurge on the run with your hands up and be running at your combat speed of 417, which is super, super nice now. That was a huge buff to mages across the board. Make sure that you're using that capability to your advantage. Professions are, it's kind of a veteran build. You can do whatever you like. Things that I care about on this build is if you're going to run it the way I like with the Curite and the Ranger and the Tower Shield, you want to be able to make that stuff yourself, specifically the armor, because if you look at how I built the armor, you've got Panzer Carapace Iron for head, Panzer Scale Iron for chest, Panzer Carapace Blood Silk arms, Plate Scale Blood Silk legs. This is all different stuff that takes a lot to craft, and you'll see that the free armor weight without a trinket is 24.7. The equipped weight with that tower shield, the Ironwood Tongue Steel Tower Shield, is 24.57. The goal around designing this armor set right here was around having the heaviest, most potent tower shield possible, because you're really going to lean on that to keep you alive in fights. Because when we toggle it off, we want to have the highest mana regeneration possible while still having pretty decent armor, and then kind of skimping on the legs a little bit because the torso kind of covers those and kind of conceals that you have weaker legs on. You still got Plate Scale Blood Silk. It's still like okay, it's not like you're naked, but the idea here is kind of min-maxing around where you're probably going to be getting hit and then also having the good mana regeneration when your tower shield is gone as well. And because it requires kind of a custom tailored suit, like if you think about it in real life, a tailored suit is going to fit you a lot better than something you buy off the rack. Same thing here. You want to be able to custom tailor your armor so that your mana regeneration is good. You know that what you're using is designed to give you the most benefit. Let's talk about spells. Actually, let's talk about clades here real quick. Most important thing here is Tactician. You're able to fireball your own team and do half damage, which is super powerful. It's probably going to get nerfed. Everybody's screaming for it to get nerfed. This Warcry is also really, really good. If people are awe-surging, fireballing, or doing any kind of AoE magic into your line, dropping that is great. Rough Rider allows you to put only a few points into Mounted Magery. I think it's like Controlled Riding is 2 points and Mounted Magery is 1 point, and that unlocks it. So you have at least 20 points in Mounted Magery. Not the perfect build, but still good. Still a really powerful, like, free points basically. Everything else is, more or less pretty basic. Here you've got the damage bonuses, the strength bonuses, everything is great. I mean, you're a human, so you have so much action skills and profession skills and everything, which is really good. Let's talk about a couple different spells that I wanted to shout out. Obviously, you have access to everything except for Spiritism. When you're looking at your spell book, you're going to have basically every spell in the game, except for the ability to res and mental projectile. So you have a lot of utility here that most people don't think about. So if you're doing AoE damage, this is from top to bottom here. If we want to do AoE damage, we got Fireball, we got Lightning Bolt, right? Fireball generally hits for a little bit harder. Lightning Bolt has better AoE, so it's better for wall banging on houses. For PvE and zoning, you've got Static Charge. Static Charge has some of the highest DPS in the game for enemies that are standing in it, and PvE mobs love to stand in it. You can stack that with Firewall as well. Both of these are pretty cheap. You can see that you can do one Lightning Bolt for about 40. You can do Static Charge and Firewall for 40 as well. This is going to do way more damage, but you can't rely on a player to stand in that. So PvE is great. It's also really good for killing pets. So if somebody puts a big pet on you, you can just drop a Firewall, stand in it, heal yourself, and keep yourself up through it, and it will just melt that pet. So that's really, really nice, really, really powerful. Other things, you've got spammable abilities like Shock. Shock is really, really good in PvP. It's cheap. It's 15 mana. This is a little bit higher because I took these screenshots on my Dex Mage, which has 117 intellect, and this Dragon Knight build has 109, so the numbers will be just slightly lower, but still you're doing 35 to 46 damage with a Shock, which is super powerful on a 1.5 second cast speed. It's also really cheap, just running nothing but Cuprum basically. Ember is a new spammable ability. They just buffed it. They made it a 1 second cast. It does tons of damage for the cast. It does blunt damage, which is really powerful because it's hard to get blunt protection in the game right now, and you can spam it in PvE as well, and mobs just melt mobs with it. It's only 10 mana, so it's extremely mana efficient. You don't have a ton of mana to begin with, so this is important for you. Mana cost is important, and when you're casting these spells, you really need to be choosy with this build. You don't have infinite mana. Mana is almost a 1 mana bar resource. You have 45% mana regeneration. As a human with Shamanistic, you can sit down and get mana back faster than anybody else, but it's going to be tough. You only have 150 mana. AoE healing. People are sleeping on these two abilities right here, guys. Mending Vapors. Notice here the big thing. Removes Ignited and Frostbitten. Stilling Mist is even better. Ignited, Warmed, Frostbitten, and Chilled. When somebody fireballs you, or fireballs all your friends, there's a lot of tick damage that comes through, and the more annoying thing for your mages is the tick damage interrupts casting, which is so annoying. Mending Vapors is fantastic for cleansing all of that and getting rid of it. It also heals for a decent amount. It costs 15 mana to cast it, where lesser heal costs, I think, 4. So I did some math. The break-even point for Mending Vapors is 3 targets. You can also cast it on yourself by looking down and walking forward as you cast it, or at least sprinting forward as soon as it finishes its cast. But Mending Vapors, if you're hitting 3 targets, it is a net positive from the mana perspective. So 3 targets is great. It's also really, really good for healing packs of zombies. With 150 mana, you're probably not going to have a pack of zombies, but if you're running with other mages and stuff like that who do, yes, great. One thing to note here is Mending Vapors peels reflect, which is bad, and hopefully they change that because it's a heal. It shouldn't peel reflect. But if your buddies have reflect up, they might be annoyed if you put Mending Vapors on them. Same with Stealing Mist. Stealing Mist is just Mending Vapors on steroids. It costs 35 mana, so quite a bit more, but it heals for a lot more. It heals for between 3 and 5 per tick. Generally, it's like 3 is what I've been seeing, but it ticks a lot. One thing that you have to have for Stealing Mist, though, is you have to have the purified water, which is kind of annoying. But if you're carrying it, it's a really, really good thing to put in your backline. You can drop it on your backline before the fight starts, and then anybody that's backpedaling or is already in danger, they're getting healed. They're getting their fire ticks cleansed. They're getting all of that stuff taken care of automatically. So this is a really, really powerful spell that most people don't know is powerful, or they don't use it right now. Something to think about. Utility, Shadow. Shadow is super powerful because it stops people from being able to close doors. They nerfed the shit out of it. It's now 60 mana. It used to be like 15 or 20. And nobody uses it for anything but blocking a door. If you stand inside the bubble, you can see out of it, so it's kind of a meme. You could like put it into a hallway and then walk in and scout the hallway without revealing your numbers. But for 60 mana, like no one is doing that. No one is doing that. So it's a utility still for keeping doors open. If you're going to go dive a building and you don't want them shutting the door on you, throwing this in the doorway will keep it up and allow your guys to push in. Ice Barrier, again, another situational spell. It's been nerfed several times, but it's still decent. Costs 30 mana, throws up an ice dome that blocks anybody from going through it either direction. You can't get out, you can't go in. So you could potentially trap people, you could potentially zone off. It's useful for climbing. So if you want to like jump on a roof or get into an area you shouldn't be able to get into, Ice Barrier is also decent for that. So you have a lot of different options here. There's a whole bunch of other spells I'm not even talking about here. Comet is probably somewhat decent. There's all the direction spells. You could potentially make tornadoes and do all the crazy shit. Like this build has all of that in it, but these spells on screen are probably the most useful ones that you're going to get the most value out of. All right, so let's talk about tier list. Do you like this logo? God, Midjourney is so great. They do some cool shit. We'll talk about PvP later. PvE, it's up there. You can wear really heavy armor, so you take less damage from melee. You know what? I'll put it in B tier. You don't have any mounted skills, so out in the open world, you have to like kind of fist fight stuff. You're not doing trolls. You're not doing anything like that. But you have these spells that I just talked about. You've got Firewall, you've got Static Charge. Both of those are super, super powerful. Now you can spam Ember, so it trivializes all the more beginner content in the game. You can go out and just spam those on bandits, and you'll be able to clean them out. The downside, though, is your uptime, like how frequently you're able to just keep killing things. If you're a good footy, it's not that hard. But if you're just using your magic to kind of trivialize content, you're taking your armor off constantly. You're sitting down, you're waiting, like you do a pull, you derobe, sit down, wait, put all your armor back on. It's like super tedious and annoying from that perspective, but you can do a lot of the different content in the game with relative ease. You're not going to be super useful when it comes to like doing bosses. You're not going to be super useful when it comes to like doing trolls. You're not going to be able to do most of that stuff without other people's help. So I'll put it in B tier. It's above average. Like you can trivialize a lot of content, but it's not the best. It's definitely not the best. Solo, I'd put this probably slightly below average. There are ways to do it solo, but because your speed is slow, you have less health, right? If you get somebody on you that's faster than you, you're not going to be able to escape, and you're at a disadvantage because of how your build is designed. If you look at the build, we've got a bunch of footy stuff, a bunch of mage stuff, and if you're doing one, the other side of the tree is offline, so it's almost like straight down the middle. So if you're in a foot fight, your magic stuff is all useless. And if they're a foot fighter and they're a dedicated foot fighter and they're on top of you, you're having a bad day. And same thing, if you're in a magic battle with a dex mage that you can't possibly catch, you're not going to have the mana that you need to kill that guy. So playing it solo is going to be a little bit rough. Same thing with the 1v1s. It's going to be a little bit rough. I'd probably put it down here. Dueling. You can duel in this build. You can it's below average because you have... We'll put it in E tier. You know, dueling, when we're talking about the difference between these two, 1v1 is like fighting any other build in the game to the death, and dueling is fighting every other build, or like dueling in town with like no magic, just melee only, like the honorable duels. You can learn on it. You have defensive stance, you have the ability to be a foot fighter, you have decent stats across the board, but you're at a pure disadvantage because of what we talked about already, where half your build is a mage, half your build is a foot fighter. So it's enough to learn the basic mechanics, but you're not going to be excelling at that stuff. I wouldn't be challenging people to ego duels and bringing this character out. It's going to be a little bit rough. 1vx, same thing. I'll put it in D tier. There's ways that you can do it. You know, you can use walkers. You can make like 1 or 2 greater walkers to zone for yourself. You have Akban, so you're really hard to kill. You can tower shield, get in a corner, spam heals on yourself. You could, you know, maybe put a point into ritualism and get a free throwaway torpedo pet that does like good damage but has like no health. Like there's ways that you could 1vx. You could zone people out with elementalism spells and then kill somebody in the back line, or throw Surges out to pepper up the front line. If you got like 2 or 3 guys pushing you, you can Surge first to kind of chip damage all these guys down, and then maybe be able to outplay them, but it's going to be really tough. It's really not designed for that type of stuff. Offense, I'd say it's B tier. It's above average. Again, you're not the best foot fighter, you're not the best mage, you don't have the highest intellect, but where this build really shines is it's got really good defense. I'd say it's an A tier, maybe even S tier, depending on what kind of armor you're wearing. But you know, you could do the biggest tower shield possible on steel, with the idea that when you get pushed, you just go into a corner in steel with a tower shield, throw it on. You're not moving. Who cares about, you know, your mana regeneration is not going to get any worse at that point. Who cares? You just go into a tower mode, you become a turret, and you stand in the corner and fucking heal yourself, and nobody will be able to kill you. Like a mage might be able to come over and like static charge you out of the corner or something if they have the presence of mind to do that, but that's probably not going to happen. You can also flip around and do death hands and stuff like that to really fuck people up. So from a defensive standpoint, it's actually pretty good. You can play this really, really defensively. You have Akban, you have all those different things. I wouldn't say it's S tier. It's not like an Ogmir. It's not like a Dark Archer that's like unkillable in the open world. It's still pretty good though. This is where it excels though. Team fights. This is such a good build for team fights. If you wanted to play this more like the Ninja Turtle build and make it a dungeon banger, you could lower your dex all the way down to whatever it is, like 35 or something. Be extremely slow. Your combat movement speed would go down to 380, but you'd have a ton more mana to play with. You could do all these different spells more frequently. Your mana regeneration would go up because it's based on the total pool. Even though the percent would stay the same, your regeneration would actually be higher. So there's a lot of different ways you can play this build. I might, if it was me and I was building this character specifically for team fights, I'd probably lower the dex and bring the psych up, because I don't really care about movement speed. I already know that it's in the shitter, so might as well lean into it and get myself some more mana, because mana is more useful to me on this build. Cost, like if I'm running a dedicated kit, this is really expensive. You're not going to generate a ton of money with this build because it's not super good at PvE, but yeah, what can I say though? It's you're going to be running full steel, or you're going to be running a really expensive tower shield, plus all the reagents for Necro and Elemental and Ecumenical, which is basically everything in the game, including spirit boxes. So it's really expensive to step out the gate with this, and then the trinkets for this type of build, because this build is so popular, the trinkets are super expensive. So there's a lot of different downsides there. It's really terrible for money generation. Utility, S tier. It's got every spell school except for Spiritism. The only thing you can't do is res. But from a utility perspective, you're fantastic. You can earthquake people off of their mounts. You can do AoE healing, AoE damage. You can do zone control. You can do walkers. You can do Akban. You can do everything that you would need except for like dedicated mounted combat. Like you're not going to be super useful on a horse, but for everything else, this is so flexible. But in that same vein for uptime, when we're talking about uptime, I'm talking about how frequently are you getting value from your build. And like we talked about half the build is a mage and the other half the build is a foot fighter. So from an uptime perspective, it's kind of below average. It has gotten a lot better. Actually, we'll put it in D tier because of the recent buff. What I talked about earlier where you can hot swap weapons now, that is a huge buff to humans. I was making this suggestion ages ago, giving them some kind of fast draw option, because toggling between melee and magic was such a pain in the ass before. It used to take 3 seconds to sheath, 2 seconds to pull your hands up, another 2 seconds to cast, another 2 seconds to put your weapon away. Like, toggling between the two was almost impossible. Now it is super doable. It takes a second to go between one to the other, so swapping between those is really viable now. So the uptime is a lot better than it used to be. If this was back in the day, this would probably be F tier, but now I'd say it's slightly below average. Again, it doesn't matter, you know, what you're doing. The other half of your build is not in play. So you're, again, emphasizing in the beginning, like I talked about, you are full Tendremic human. You're not going to be the best at anything. You're not the tankiest. You're not the best mage. You don't have the highest intellect. You don't have the most mana. You don't have the most health. You don't have any of that stuff. But you're doing everything pretty well, right? Everything that you're doing is usable. Skill cap, S tier would be like easiest to use and get value from. F tier would be like hardest to use and get value from. I'd say it's middle of the road. This is, you're not going to be focused on speed and positioning so much. I mean, it's always important to not get out of position, but you should be playing not frontline, but like mid to backline here, and then flexing, you know, peeling for other mages. If you have dedicated mages next to you, you're peeling for them. You're using your mana bar to heal. You should be using your mana bar at the beginning of the fight so that you can get some value from the regeneration as the fight goes on, and then rotate into the foot fighting side of things as your mana depletes. Crafting, it's a human, so I'll put it in the middle of the road here, but like I talked about before, you want to be able to custom tailor your armor and your shield if you can. So you're going to be kind of pigeonholed into those specific professions, but since you're a human and you could potentially go down the artisan route and get that unlocked, like you have really high stats on intellect and some psych and like a bunch of free points in a lot of the different crafting things. It's not terrible. I wouldn't say it's amazing. You're not a dedicated mage. You're not somebody that's actually going to pick up the artisan skill by default, but it's got the potential there, so it's middle of the road for crafting. There's no real downsides to being a human. Fun, I'd say this is either A tier or S tier for me. Like, I'll probably put it in S tier. From a fun perspective, when you are weaving in and out of, you know, it's obviously subjective, but to me, when I'm weaving in and out of melee into ranged, into magic, casting, you know, back and forth and pulling out my weapon, like that feeling, getting value from your full kit is so good. It feels amazing. You know, you get in a foot fight, you hit the guy twice with the hammer, he gets low, he backpedals off, he's running away from you, you immediately swap and start awe-surging him from distance, or you shoot a fireball and it hits him and blows him the fuck up. Like, that is fun. That feels fucking great. PvP, I'd say this is probably A or B tier. It was B tier before. I'd say now with these new buffs, it's probably A tier, because what really was holding this type of build back, holding hybrids back a lot, was toggling weapons back and forth. So I feel like it's really good now from a PvP perspective. Just keep in mind that playing solo is going to be really rough. This is a build that you should be playing if you're dedicated to your guild, your team. You know that you're going to have friends with you, which is, you know, honestly how you should be playing Mortal in my opinion anyways. This game is so much better with friends, so much better with a guild. So if you do have that capability with you, and you do have friends that are going to be going out with you into the dungeon or whatever, this is really good for PvP. If it's something that you're going to be playing solo, I would say it's much lower. This is D, E, or F for PvP in that regard. It's going to be really tough to play this by yourself. Overall, I'd say this is probably A or B. It's somewhere in the middle. I'll put it in A tier. A lot of people really enjoy these builds. A lot of people enjoy playing them. Like I talked about before, Dragon Knight is more of a mage-focused version, and Death Knight is more of a footy version, where you don't even have elementalism on the Death Knight build. You have other things like aggressive stance and things like that. So that's the Dragon Knight, guys. Thank you for voting. I'll put up another poll soon. Again, this is going to be available for members probably a week early, so if you're not a member to the channel and you want to get ahead of this stuff and you want to, build these characters sooner or see videos faster, or just see other cool clips, like I just uploaded a member video not that long ago of just a cool clip from a dungeon. All of that stuff is available. Just click the join button next to the subscribe button, and we'll go from there. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Oh man, what a tough decision. Do I want to use a pokey stick or do I want to fire Hadoukens and Kamehameha blasts? What an enticing decision. I'm really gonna have to think about.
What kind of hentai you guys prefer?
The ones with the tentacles.
I like the ones where chicks have dicks, you know?